Chapter 27 Arcade Monkeys. Tony followed directions he was given to the garage. He hadn't been there before, and he had to go over one of those tree transitions, high in the trees. He didn't like crossing those. The sun was just about to go down. The directions he was given was follow this hallway to the end, and after the last hollowed out tree, walk for a half a mile directly to the east, and the garage is built under a tiny hill. Tony got to the end of the tribe's hollowed out trees. He clicked the hidden latches above and below the door like he was taught, exited out into the forest, and walked. He felt like he had gone a half a mile and didn't see any garage. There was a small hill about another half a mile away. He figured he'd try that, and if that wasn't it, he'd have to go back and get real directions. That hill was it. As he got closer, he saw a garage door was open. He noticed on the top of the garage it looked like fake rocks. He imagined if you closed the door, it would camouflage the garage completely. Nice, he thought. Sitting there in the middle of the garage was a black Jeep. Seemed to be an old model, maybe from the 90s. The Jeep had crude graffiti and tags all over it. It was dented and scarred with bullet holes like it had seen a lot of action. All around the edges of the Jeep were strange-looking handholds. Around the Jeep were roughly 20 beings, a mix of apes and monkeys. Way more than Tony thought. "Can we take this many?" Tony asked the crowd. "Yeah, human. No problem," a chimp said, emerging from the crowd. He must have been the driver. He had very short jean shorts, frayed along the bottom, with a huge set of keys attached to a belt loop. And the other distinguishing feature was a big growth on his cheek. It kind of reminded Tony of Lemmy from Motorhead. "I'm Lemmy," he said. Tony should have guessed. Lemmy was loading a bunch of those Elosa computer stacks into a compartment below the back seat. He secured them with a strap and smiled. "Gonna be a bumpy ride." "Hey, Lemmy," Tony said, and then continued, "I just gotta say, if the human police see a Jeep with all of us in it, they will try to capture us and probably shoot to kill." Tony was doubting the entire trip now. The monkeys and apes looked at each other. Most shrugged and didn't seem to care. One orangutan and one chimp stepped out of the crowd. "No go, no go. Police in my land shoot to kill," Tony went on. "Come on, why you scare us?" Lemmy replied. The one gorilla of the group stepped up. "I crush." Short, tight movements of his body, a chain with a round ball at the end swung around his body in a figure-8 motion. It looked effortless. He then reached out one of his hands, and the ball's heavy weight slapped to a stop in his hand. They didn't understand, Tony thought, but he was also pretty sure he wasn't going to convince them otherwise. He just shook his head. Lemmy took the shaking of Tony's head as an A-OK, even though that's not what he meant. Lemmy leaned into Tony and confirmed and asked at the same time, "So just go south?" Then Lemmy yelled out to everyone in the garage, "Okay, let's go!" Then he ran over to the garage office to grab something. His super short jean shorts made this look pretty funny to Tony. All the apes and monkeys in the garage swarmed towards the Jeep, disappearing into it like clowns into a clown car. Some hopped on top, some hung from the side, and others disappeared into the crowd. Tony had no idea how they all fit, but now he knew what all those handholds were for. They had at least 20 living beings in and on the Jeep at the moment. Lemmy hopped in the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine feebly tried to turn over. A bunch of monkeys in the Jeep shook their heads like, "Oh no, not again." One chimp jumped over the windshield and hopped on the trunk with a loud bam, bam. Lemmy turned the key and the Jeep let out a growl of black smoke and started humming. Lemmy gave the engine a few revs, smiled, and looked over at Tony as his Jeep jerked into gear. While still in the garage, a few monkeys jumped up in frustration, seeming to say to Lemmy, like, "Let's go faster!" He looked back for a long moment and then floored it. Heading straight for the open garage door, all of Tony's driving instinct alarms were going off. They were going way too fast. They were going to flip if he tried to turn at this speed. The Jeep zipped out of the garage. They had to turn in about 100 feet. Tony grabbed onto the oh shit handles with both hands, preparing to crash. Lemmy touched the brake, downshifted, and hit the gas. Dirt flew in a rooster tail behind the Jeep as it slid sideways. In any vehicle Tony had ever been in, this was a crash. They were going to flip. But the Jeep unnaturally gripped the dirt and drifted around the corner. Tony looked behind him, and all the monkeys on the inside were leaning into the turn. To Tony's right, apes hung off the Jeep, using all their weight to help the Jeep turn. Holy crap, Tony thought, scared shitless. Then once he felt like they weren't going to crash, his thought turned to, oh shit, that was fucking cool. They were heading down the mountain. A giant drop was coming. Tony's brief thought of cool was quickly turned back to, oh shit, as they caught massive air. Tony looked behind to see a sea of monkeys and apes smiling and hanging onto the Jeep midair. They were having the time of their lives. A few looked like they were in free fall, holding onto the Jeep like they were doing a Superman. One chimp did it with his tail. Extra style points for that guy. It felt like they were in the air for 10 seconds, but it was probably only a few. Lemmy shifted into gear and the engine revved, tilting the Jeep to land at the correct angle. They hit the ground and the shocks of the Jeep gave in all the way to the ground with a thud, a scrape, and the sound of a bunch of monkeys slamming into a Jeep. Tony's head bashed the dashboard so hard blood started flowing down his forehead. Lemmy looked over him, slapped him in the shoulder, and laughed. Tony didn't laugh. It hurt. He felt the warm wetness and reached for it. The ride was so bumpy he slapped himself in the face. But he did see the red and confirmed he was bleeding. Nothing else he could do at this time. They caught their big air again. Tony braced his head this time. Once they hit the mountain bottom, they began cruising. Tony noticed the speedometer was normally between 40 and 50. So they might be there in about an hour, he thought. Beer time. Oh shit, where was I? They might get there in an hour. The sun was almost down now. If they got there in an hour, Treetop would still be open. It'd probably be best if they just waited till it was closed and then snuck in, Tony was thinking. But they'd have to play it by ear. Tony thought about all the ways this could get messy really quick. For over an hour, they drove. Every few minutes, Lemmy would look for a bump or ramp to catch air off. If nothing was around, he'd swerve some heavy corners just to get some action, his passengers knowing exactly how to lean on every turn. On a few of the really sharp turns, Tony saw some apes hanging so low their feet were skimming on the ground. Over the hill to their left, Tony noticed something moving. It was people cresting the hill and running over towards them. Cannibals, he thought? Then he saw spears protruding from their arms. Tony pointed and nudged Lemmy. Lemmy had driving goggles on, and he looked in that direction. He saw them and turned. The fuck, he's turning towards them? Tony thought. Lemmy looked over to a gorilla behind him and smiled. Apes and monkeys let out hoots and hollers. Lemmy floored it. The Jeep lurched forward, accelerating. There were 10 or 12 cannibals. As they approached, the hooting and hollering approached a drawn-out battle cry. Lemmy adjusted his angle at the last minute, plowing over the first cannibals, but his adjustment allowed him to hit a few more behind the first. Bodies split in half over the trunk of the Jeep as it crushed cannibals. Spears clanged ineffectively against the front of the Jeep. A dismembered chest and head slid up towards Lemmy. He laughed and turned so the head would spill off to the side. As the head fell, a gorilla grabbed it in midair, held it up to his own face, and made a mocking scream, then tossed it onto the ground. All the apes and monkeys laughed. The front of the Jeep was covered in blood. Tony thought, aha, driving around a bloody Jeep. This should make us even more inconspicuous. He looked behind and saw 3 cannibals, still running after the Jeep, like stupid AI in a game. They'd been driving for more than an hour, the sun down now, but the sky looked strange to Tony. It wasn't a normal night sky. It wasn't a normal Valley Forest night sky. The fence should be around here, Tony thought. Just as he was about to say that to Lemmy, they saw the fence. They all waited for a minute or two as the fence approached. Tony pointed with his thumb to the right, and Lemmy turned. They drove a few minutes until Tony saw the area with the hole they had crawled through to start this adventure. He remembered it was still a 2 or 3 mile hike to Valley Forest. He was thinking they couldn't bring the Jeep through the hole, so they'd probably have to walk. The Jeep slowed and rolled up to the hole in neutral. A few monkeys jumped off the Jeep to investigate. It was a giant hole now. It had tracks going in and out of it. Tire tracks, human tracks, animal tracks. The Jeep could easily fit through. A tank could have easily driven under the hole right now. Lemmy motioned to the monkeys, and they jumped back on. He never even came to a complete stop. They cruised down into the hole, but then hit the gas on the way out, and the Jeep did a wheelie. Apes and monkeys in the back leaned farther back and held the wheelie up longer than they should. Shit, crazy-ass monkeys, Tony thought, squeezing the oh shit handles. Lemmy pointed south, and Tony nodded. They drove a few minutes in silence. Tony again noticed the air seemed different. It was hard to tell anything in the dark, but something just felt different. Maybe it was the air. Maybe he'd been gone for too long. He peered his head up, trying to look over the trees. The tip of Treetop Games emerged. There it is, Tony yelled. Lemmy yelled back, where are all those murderous cops you were scaring us with? Oh, they're out here, Tony replied. They rolled up to the trees behind Treetop. It was the north part of town, Park Street, an already abandoned street. They should be able to park around here and go up without being noticed. Tony looked up at the once familiar treetop. It looked like one of those big bay windows overlooking the city was cracked or broken. Above Treetop, gray, dark clouds flowed and splashed through the sky like an angry river. Lemmy killed the motor. That it? He asked, but he knew. Everyone grab a stacker before going up, he told the car. The clown car of a Jeep emptied. Most of the apes and monkeys stayed behind Tony, heads tilting, looking around in curiosity. Tony noticed the elevator lights were off. Those were usually on even after they closed. He walked towards the rickety stairs and started jogging up. His partners mostly ignored the stairs, since to them that was the slowest, most energy-consuming way. They swarmed around the stair supports, climbing up it in all directions. From the outside, it looked like one of those big CG shots in Planet of the Apes. They got to the top. Tony was pretty tired. The door was locked. He looked past the locked doors and saw trash on the floor. Trash on the floor at Treetop Games? That never happened. He looked closer. It wasn't looted or anything, at least not fully. A gorilla grabbed the door and pulled it apart. It bent and then ripped and the glass shattered. The gorilla looked at Tony like, Tony took the first step in, and then the monkeys and apes quickly came in silently behind him, their eyes all open with wide interest. Tony tried the light switch. Nothing. Monkeys were picking up things off the ground and examining them. They were all keeping pretty silent still. He walked across the main floor of Treetop from the elevator towards the bay windows, looking for anything out of the ordinary. It seemed to be good old Treetop Games, he remembered. It looked kind of like an earthquake had knocked a few things over, but that was it. He approached the window. It was cracked. He looked out and saw Valley Forest in rubble. Dun dun dun. What the? He cried out without trying. Lemmy was at his side. What's wrong? For a moment, Tony said nothing. The angry river of dark clouds above him swam by. He looked down at the town he grew up in. Ruins. It looked like a future scene from the first Terminator. It was totally destroyed. No building was left standing. Tony, Elle, and Perry's apartments were gone. The whole apartments were leveled to a point where it was hard to make out what street was which. A few areas that weren't rubble were craters. There were no lights, no electricity, it seemed. A few places, thin wisps of smoke rose to the sky. But Park Street was untouched. Although it had been abandoned long ago, and everything except Treetop Games was a boarded-up shell of a building. The buildings on Park Street were not destroyed. Treetop was a little messy, but it seemed okay. Tony stared longer. Certain areas seemed to stand out. There were war store tracks going through the heart of the city. The Telnet War Store Corps was still on the edge of town. The old shitty Walmart was completely destroyed. Perry's favorite Taco Bell, gone. Tony turned around. Almost all the monkeys and apes were standing behind him silently. You home? One of them asked. Yeah. Right there. Tony pointed down into the rubble. Something bad happened here. He felt the need to explain. It wasn't like this before. There were 80,000 people that lived here. Like 2 weeks ago. His friends looked at each other puzzled, thinking, whoops. All your tribe dead? Someone in the crowd asked. My tribe already dead, Tony replied. Just memories. Lemmy said, well then let's party! And he held up a white worm. Woo! The apes and monkeys dispersed. Some stayed to enjoy worms, others opened up games looking at the packaging. They didn't know about old school classic games. What a treasure museum they were rummaging through. To them, the cash register was just as interesting as an NES system or the original Pong arcade cabinet Treetop owned. Lemmy did a worm. He shook and danced as it entered his nasal cavity. Just as Tony was about to do a worm, a chimp's head popped up over his shoulder. And he said, it was Marley, and he said, Hey, Mon, show me that one game. Okay, hang on. Tony sniffed really hard and sucked the worm up his nose. He reached down and held on to a rack of games to stand up. Euphoria filled his eyes and head, and he slowly looked over at Bob, his eyes moving first, then his head trailing behind. Ho-ho, it's over there, he said and stumbled over. He tried to get up, but a game was stuck to his hand. It was Superman for the N64. He laughed out loud. Oh, worst game ever! And he threw it like a left-handed baby. It flew randomly and bounced into a spot it would never be seen again. Good, because that game sucked. Bob did a worm, and they both relaxed in an aisle full of games for a while. Bob was wearing a Rasta cap today and a Bad Brains shirt. He had a necklace that Tony hadn't noticed before. It had a little book hanging from it. Tony was wormed. He reached out slowly and touched the book. What's that? He asked. Bob replied, The Art of War, man. Rad. Then Bob said, Hey, man, let's go search for Ball Zero. Tony's eyes opened. Oh, shit. Yeah. They got up. They had been in Treetop for probably 10 minutes now, and all the make on and fuck, and all the monkeys and apes were starting to feel comfortable. They were scattered everywhere, even on the walls and ceiling. Lemmy walked up and joined Bob and Tony as they walked towards the arcade section. Near the front of the arcade section, there were 4 linked Rush 2049 sit-down racing cabinets. Tony said in a wormy voice as they passed it, "Oh, that game rules. Best racing game ever." Threw a drunk arm pointing it at the 4 linked Rush machines. Lemmy reached over and touched an Elosa computer stack to the side of the cabinet. The stack stuck to the cabinet. The Rush machine screen flickered on and lit up. In its trademark loud whisper, the arcade machine let out a "Rush!" and the frenetic electronic music started. Tony stopped in amazement. Wait a second, he thought. What? Let me touch that stack to a piece of wood on the side of the cabinet, and it powered it up through the wood, and it stuck to the wood? Wait, no. That works? Tony questioned out loud to no one. That's fucking cool! 3 other monkeys slapped stacks to the side of the other Rush cabinets, and they all turned on. Instantly, 4 apes filled the seats and tried to start a game. Actually, it was 3 chimps, and the last cabinet had a monkey that wasn't quite long enough to reach the gas. She used her tail to reach the gas, and she was ready, though. But they pressed the buttons and nothing happened. Bob, Tony, and Lemmy made their way to the pinball area as the tribe tripped out on Rush, even though the games didn't have any credits. There, Tony saw the best pinball game ever made, Caveman. He wobbled up to the machine and hugged it. Only a true pinball fan would understand this hug. Bob and Lemmy laughed a bit. It was a real hug, not like some wannabe hippie hugging a tree or some shit. Tony had spent thousands of hours with this exact piece of machinery. They had both together enjoyed triumph and tribulation. Lemmy stuck a stack to the side. Inside the machine, parts moved and switched. It made mechanical noises. "Oh, fuck! Do you have any quarters?" Tony asked, looking down at the coin mechanism. "Don't got that much weed on me, man," Bob said. "No, man, not weed. A quarter." "Oh, shit. Money?" Tony asked again. Then he realized what he was asking. Of course they didn't. Tony was about to ask them to rip off the lock, but he remembered no one was here. He could just go get a key. He'd been in the office many times. He ran to the back room and grabbed the master key. As he was running out of the office with the key, he noticed Elle's name tag stuck on the wall. He remembered her beautiful face and all the times they had in this back office for a second, and he was in another world. He shook his head and jogged out of the office. As he ran by the Rush machines, the chimps and 1 monkey were still in the seats, but boredom was setting in. "Oh shit, I can't forget about you guys." Tony unlocked each of the Rush coin mechanisms, then he went back to Bob and Lemmy at Caveman. "Whoa, man. This looks just like you said, man," Bob said, looking at the amazing art of the Caveman pinball machine like it was a dream. They started a 3-player game and played for hours. Bob and Tony discussed the finer points of The Search for Ball Zero and The Art of War. Pinball tactics and strategy wasn't about defeating an enemy, although you could see the enemy as the machine. A large, static enemy that didn't evolve and would always respond with the same attacks. If you hit this ramp, the ball would always come out the same way. If you sent the ball into another section, it would almost always return to the left flipper or something like that. When it came to tactics, a pinball machine was predictable, and that was its only flaw. A pinball machine never deceived you. Its lanes and ramps and mechanical ball ejects could be seen as logic lanes, the same as rigid AI state machines, impossible to detach from, impossible to adapt to a good player if it wanted to. The Art of War was all about adapting. Bob noted that the War Store game they discovered and played the other night was similar. The AI War Stores always used the same tactics. They always use the main cannon, even though the tank turrets are way more accurate, man. Reload faster and have almost unlimited ammo, Bob said, noticing the same thing Tony noticed while playing. Also, they always went for higher ground, even taking a few shots to get there, Tony noted. Oh yeah, man. And the other thing I always use against them, Bob added, if you go behind the cover, man, they will always predict you coming out the other side. Like if you go behind cover from the right, he was at the right side of the pinball machine and walked behind it. Then he said behind the machine, they think you always come out through the left. He darted his hand out to the left side of the machine to demonstrate. Then he popped out to the right and acted like he was shooting. Pop, pop, pop. Gets 'em every time, man. Tony hadn't noticed that. Really? Oh man, that seems like a big AI flaw. Watch next time, man, Bob was confident. After a few warm-up games, Tony held down the flipper button and let the high scores roll by. DNA was at top, ASS right behind him. That's me, I'm ASS, Tony said to Bob and Lemmy. Bob asked, who's DNA, man? This guy who was really good. I learned how to play pinball by watching him, Tony replied. But you know what? I'm going to beat that high score right now. The intense mental peak of the worm was over, and now Tony was riding the speed-like afterglow. He actually thought he could beat the score. Tony played an amazing game and totally destroyed DNA's score. He put on a clinic for Bob, who was watching in awe as Tony pulled every fancy pinball trick there was. Catches, passes, multi-ball holds, the Lazarus move. That's also known as a death save. Even got the elusive Caveman Super Jackpot. When that happened, the machine screamed as loud as ever and made everyone in Treetop look. They continued to play the rest of the night, switching stacks to machines they wanted to play, and by the end of the night, all the stacks were being used. Tony used a stack to turn on the microwave and heat up some of Treetop's infamous pizza. The pizza was in the giant fridge room, which had no power, but it was still kind of cold. Tony joked as he handed out the pizza, "You will have diarrhea tomorrow if you eat this." Just before sunrise, they climbed out of the 10-story, best and coolest place for games in the world, and they drove home. Tony wasn't sure if he was driving home or leaving home. Probably both.